Hello everyone and welcome to another ride overview. Today we're going to talk about one of the most unorthodox coaster types in the game, the multi-dimension coaster. It's unorthodox in two different ways. Firstly, it can go upside down for extended amounts of time instead of just briefly during an inversion. This seems very uncomfortable for the riders, but this is solved by the second special aspect of the coaster, and that is that the seats can rotate, allowing the guests to be right side up when the train is upside down. The rotation aspect is very interesting, but sadly ultimately quite useless. For every track piece you can input the amount of degrees that the seat should be rotated compared to the standard position. This goes from minus 180 to plus 495 degrees in steps of 45 degrees. This means that if you put 495 degrees on one track piece and minus 180 on the next, the seat has to do almost two entire backwards rotations. This seems a lot of fun to play with, and real multi-dimensional coasters do use this feature a lot to enhance the ride experience. But unfortunately this feature has no effect whatsoever in Roller Coaster Tycoon 2. You can of course still use it for aesthetic purposes, but it will not affect the stats or how nauseous guests get from riding it. As for things that do have an effect, this coaster has more bad aspects than good aspects. First off, it's stupidly expensive. Here we have the same exact design for three different coaster types. The mini coaster is a fairly cheap coaster type, the looping coaster is about average, and the hyper twister coaster is quite expensive. You may think that the multi-dimension coaster will be 10% or maybe 20% more expensive than the hyper twister, but nope, it's almost 50% more expensive than the already quite expensive hyper twister coaster. This is so expensive that any time you make the decision to build a multi-dimension coaster, for the same cost you could have built about two similarly sized wooden or looping coasters, or even three junior coasters. For this reason I don't recommend building it, unless the only other coaster type you have available is something terrible like the hardline coaster or mini suspended coaster. That was only one bad aspect, and it has several more. The multi-dimension coaster is, along with the swinging suspended coaster, the most nauseating coaster type in the game. It is quite common for the nausea stat to be the highest of the three, and it might even go above 10 if you're building a fairly large design. This will cause guests to puke more, which makes you need to hire more handymen to deal with that, and sometimes take a hit to your park rating if you forget to assign a handyman to the area near the exit of your multi-dimension coaster. Its intensity rating is also quite high, but that isn't always an issue, as there are guests that prefer a higher intensity rating, and some parks even have only guests who prefer 9 or more intensity. The intensity also contributes to the ride value a fair bit, so a higher intensity rating means that it gives more park value and you can charge more for it. The nausea rating also contributes, but it only contributes a third of what the intensity rating contributes and a fifth of the excitement rating. Now let's talk about what kinds of elements it has available. This is an area where it's both great and terrible. Aside from the rotating seats, the multi-dimension coaster is most well known for being able to go upside down for long amounts of time and having cool elements that involve quarter loops. This is really cool and fun to play around with, but at the same time you're very limited in what other elements it has available. I sometimes bash coaster types like the corkscrew coaster and the mine train coaster for not having banked sloped turns available. Well, the multi-dimension coaster can do one worse, as it doesn't even have sloped turns available at all. This makes it awkward to build with at times, as sloped turns are something that almost every coaster design uses. Exceptions to this are one-trick ponies like the reverse freefall coaster and small coaster types like the side friction coaster, but the multi-dimension coaster is neither of those. It's a large steel coaster type that has normal continuous circuit layouts, but for some reason it doesn't get sloped turns. By the way, quick lesson on how to use the quarter loops to go upside down. If you're high up and go down normally, you will notice that you cannot select any special elements and you can only go back to level in order to end up with a normal vertical drop instead of going upside down. If you want to go the other way and go upside down, you need to use a quarter loop at the top instead of the 3 slope transition pieces. Now, when you build a track piece to go back to a steep drop from the vertical drop, you will notice that you go the other way and will end up upside down. When you go up, it's more intuitive as it works the same way as other coaster types that have access to quarter loops. Now that we've talked about the elements, let's take a look at the stat requirements. The multi-dimension coaster needs to have at least 2 drops, it needs to have a top speed of at least 36 km per hour, it needs to have at least 0.40 negative Gs, and it needs to have at least 1 inversion. The punishments for not making these stat requirements are harsher than for most other coaster types, as here only your excitement rating gets a penalty instead of all ratings. The first 3 stat requirements divide the excitement rating by 2 if you fail to make them, and if you don't have an inversion, your excitement rating gets divided by 4. If you do have at least 1 inversion, the requirements for the drop count and negative Gs are nullified. Since you need to have at least 1 inversion anyway because of the stat requirement for it, you can just ignore those 2 requirements and only focus on the maximum speed and inversion ones. We have now reached the segment of the video where I show you some efficient designs. Because of the extremely high cost, these won't be very cost efficient, but they might come in handy in scenarios where you don't have much choice other than to build a multi-dimension coaster. Of course, you can also build them whenever you don't care about picking the most optimized coaster type, but still want a compact and efficient design. You can find a download link for these designs in the description. Firstly, there is the micro design, which is the smallest design that doesn't fill any stat requirements. This is where the multi-dimension coaster is at its best. Because it has really high stats naturally, this design actually has fairly decent stats for its cost. It's not the best microcoaster, but it's not bad either. Next up is a slightly larger design, and this is where you can really see how expensive this coaster type is. It's still quite a small design and yet it costs almost 10,000 euros. Its stats still aren't terrible for the price, but it's not good either. Since this design actually has a good maximum throughput, it's not a terrible idea to build this in your park and it can make you a good amount of money. Lastly, there is the big design. It's not too big as that would become ridiculously expensive, but it does easily have the highest stats of the 3 designs. It is also the most expensive at more than 17,000 euros, which can afford you 2 good looping or wooden coasters, so only build this if you have money to spare. It will do well in scenarios where guests prefer more intense rides, but in scenarios where guests don't all have the same preference for intense or gentle rides, it can still do quite well after you've swallowed the blow of the initial cost. Don't forget to place a handyman at the exit or the path there will turn into a vomit slip and slide. And that was the multi-dimension coaster. It's an interesting coaster type with a unique but useless feature that is annoying to build and way too expensive. Despite that, it's not entirely terrible and can still make you good money. It can be a fun challenge to build one that is actually somewhat realistic, but that's not something that I cover in my ride overviews. If you liked this video, consider giving it a like or leave a comment. You can also subscribe or follow me on Twitch. Thank you all for watching and I will see you in the next video.